So a while back, I was having a few beers with our singer Eric, and I said, I've got this theory about hard rock and heavy metal back in the 70s and 80s. He's like, all right, what is it? I said, it was like the Mafia, and grunge was like the Joker in the Dark Knight. Yep, that's the theory. Here we go. All right, how's everyone doing? Welcome to the House of Mars. We are Mars, an independent rock band. And on this channel, we talk about not just our music, but all the music, because that's what we're passionate about. Now, a couple housekeeping things real quick. I'm recording this. It is summertime in the Midwest, so you are probably going to hear lawnmowers in the background of this video. It's that time of year when all of the two-stroke engines come out of hibernation. It's the circle of life. So anyway, also, while we're at it, if you could, like and subscribe to this channel and this video. Again, we are an independent rock band, and the best and easiest way you could support us or any independent content creators is to go ahead and like and subscribe. And also, I'll leave a link as well. We've got some music over on Bandcamp. We actually created our own guerrilla studio a couple years ago, recorded our own music using our own equipment, and we're pretty damn proud about it. So I'll also leave a link there, and you can go check us out if you're into hard rock. All right, so here we go. Topic of today is, yes, back in the 1970s and the 1980s, if you think about it, hard rock and heavy metal bore a lot of resemblances to the Mafia, or at least the way the Mafia is portrayed in movies, okay? Back in that time, back in the misty 70s and back in the 80s, hard rock and heavy metal had a really bad public image problem. The general public saw them as being sort of dangerous and crude, and it was it's sometimes considered even like a threat to civilization or something. Back then, if you have, especially in the 80s, if you have any sort of passing knowledge of the era and music of that era, you had Christian fundamentalist preachers and organizations who thought that it was a direct attack on, I don't know, the American way of life. It was referred to generally as the Satanic Panic. It's a whole nother topic. I'm not going to get into it right now. But not only did hard rock and heavy metal have a problem with the general public, it was also despised by the music critics, the Rolling Stones, New Musical Express, magazines like that. I don't mean the Rolling Stones, the band, I mean the magazine. And it was seen as, well, if not dangerous, at least crude and stupid. So what happened was that you had these genres of music and the bands within them, and even the fans sort of created a parallel existence outside the mainstream music world. And it gave them this sort of outlaw sort of sheen, and certainly an attitude. They embraced it wholeheartedly, which, if you think about it, is kind of like how the Mafia is portrayed in movies, especially like Goodfellas. They're on their own program, they're out doing their own thing, they're outside, not only just outside the law, but outside the normal sort of everyday conventions of ordinary average people. They saw average people as schmucks, as a matter of fact, or some term to that effect. So what happened within hard rock and heavy metal is you had a system of patronage and respect develop. First off, with respect, young bands, young hungry bands that were coming up, they certainly were competitive with one another, but they didn't engage in sort of, I guess you'd say, outright warfare. They understood that they all had common cause. They were all trying to make it. So they would usually avoid direct confrontations with one another. I don't mean physical confrontations, but calling one another out, sabotaging one another. There was healthy competition. There were the flyer wars, where you would rip down the other band's flyers and put yours up on top. But again, a lot of it was up-and-coming bands recognizing the fact that they were all in the, ideally they wanted everyone to succeed. Everyone wanted a record deal. So they weren't going to backstab each other too much. Now, of course, there are examples of bands going after one another, taking shots, practically engaging in open warfare with one another in the public arena. One of the most ridiculous examples of it was when Vince Neil called out Axl Rose to an actual fist fight on like Headbangers Ball sometime in the late 80s. So obviously there are exceptions, but generally the bands, they would hang out together. Yes, there was competitiveness, but generally they all wanted to succeed. Now, as far as the topic of patronage is an idea that stretches back to ancient Rome and further into Italian and Sicilian culture, where what you have is a person of some social stature and wealth who would act as a patron and a protector of lower status and poorer people. And this sort of thing developed in hard rock and especially heavy metal. You had older, more established acts who would see other acts that they liked or thought showed promise, and they would sort of offer them patronage. They would offer them opening slots on tours, and they would give them favorable mentions if they were being interviewed or something like that. And in return, these younger acts would offer their sort of support and fealty, if you will, and the respect to these older acts. A younger band would never, ever publicly run down an older, more established act. If a young band came out and ran down Led Zeppelin or Judas Priest, not only would they be shunned by those bands, but they'd be shunned by the fans in general, because it was seen, you didn't do that. You didn't run down the Godfathers. What are you, stupid? So they always paid respect, at least in public, to these older bands. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't some high-profile hits from time to time. There are some examples of younger bands taking out older, more established acts, and all of a sudden I'm going like this. Is where, yes, I'm in character right now. One of the earliest examples of a younger act taking out an older one was Led Zeppelin. Back in 1968, they had just started out, and they were going out on tour with Iron Butterfly. Now, at the time, Iron Butterfly was huge globally. They had several hits. They had made the charts, had very good selling albums, and they were pioneering this new sort of heavy music, as it was called, because it hadn't quite sort of congealed into hard rock or heavy metal yet. But they were huge in this new genre. Led Zeppelin was brought out on tour with them. They were a young act. Iron Butterfly liked them. They were all pals. I think Iron Butterfly was English as well. And they were brought out as a support act. But here's the thing. Led Zeppelin they were a crew, all right? And they were ruthless, especially their manager, Peter Grant. And once they were out on tour, Grant saw that Led Zeppelin had more energy, were more dynamic, and quite frankly, were just better than Iron Butterfly. So he, at one point in late 1968, told Led Zeppelin, look, boys, go out there and kill it. Wipe them off the stage. So obviously, if you've ever been to a concert, there are opening acts, and usually an opening act gets a half hour, maybe 45 minutes to play, right? Led Zeppelin went out and played for 2 hours straight, completely demolishing the crowd. Once they finally came off stage, Iron Butterfly refused to go out on stage because they realized that they had been completely upstaged by their opening act. In terms of rock band or touring etiquette, this was about as subtle as a daylight mob hit in a crowded restaurant. Another example happened later in the 70s with Black Sabbath, another English band, while we're at it. Black Sabbath had essentially created the genre of heavy metal and spent most of the 70s as absolute monsters. But by the late 70s, the band was fracturing from within. They had been touring for years. They were tired. They were having problems with one another. And they went out on tour in the late 70s with a little unheard of band from Pasadena called Van Halen, or as I like to call them, the Smiling Assassins. Van Halen came across these fun, happy, exuberant kids, just glad to be out on tour, and every night they went out and they absolutely fucking crushed it. They went out there with energy and determination, and they were like a war machine. Completely upstaged Black Sabbath every night. As a matter of fact, when Ozzy Osbourne saw them, and he kind of saw that, okay, this is the future of the music, and he saw the energy that they had, and he saw how tight they were in comparison to his own band, who were, again, falling apart from within, he got even more despondent, fell more heavily into drugs and alcohol abuse, and eventually got kicked out of the band. And after that, Black Sabbath went on with other singers throughout the 80s, continued putting out good music, but they were never quite the same, and Van Halen went on to be Van Halen. But despite all that, by the early 1980s, hard rock and heavy metal were doing really well. They had finally broken through to not just the music mainstream, but the cultural mainstream. It was simply too big of a genre and too big of a cultural force to be ignored. And eventually, it bled out into fashion and other forms of music. Even on Top 40 radio, you would hear songs where it would be a completely conventional pop song, but they would have this sort of, Eddie Van Halen-esque, two-handed tapping or dive bombing sort of solo just kind of shoehorned in the middle of the song, just because that's what the people wanted now. When a lot of the hard rock and heavy metal acts, especially the ones from the West Coast, started adopting sort of the cowboy look, all of a sudden you couldn't go anywhere without seeing people dressed in cowboy hats and leather dusters and cowboy boots. It was ridiculous. And to top it off, by the late 80s, heavy metal and hard rock even had a little bit of political clout and political cachet. You had back then, it was the PMRC, the Parental Music Resource Center, which was basically just, as Frank Zappa put it, a bunch of bored Washington housewives who used the fact that their husbands were senators or congressmen or whatever to try, and they sort of teamed up with conservative and religious groups out in the United States to set up, basically to attempt to censor hard rock and heavy metal based on the lyrics or the album covers and that sort of thing. And it was a whole deal. At one point, there was a congressional hearing. Frank Zappa showed up, gave a very dignified and very well-structured and very effective speech to Congress, before Congress. John Denver came out and spoke out on behalf of free speech, even though this guy was the most all-American, just fresh-faced golden boy that you could ever imagine. He came out in defense of hard rock and heavy metal and said, free speech is free speech. And to top it off, you had D motherfucking Snyder from Twisted Sister show up. Not in a suit and tie like the other two had. He shows up in a denim vest, his usual regalia, a denim vest with patches on all over it, jeans, snakeskin cowboy boots, the hair out to here, and gives the snottiest, most sarcastic delivery to Congress that you've ever seen, but it was also incredibly intelligent. He ran circles around the congressmen and their housewives. It was epic. So by the end of the 80s, hard rock and heavy metal was lucrative. That's for sure. Everybody was making money. It was relevant and it was cool. So now here's where the second part of the theory comes in, where if hard rock and heavy metal were like the Mafia, then grunge was like the Joker from The Dark Knight. And before I go on, yes, I know all the grunge artists don't like it being called grunge. They don't like being labeled, blah, 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 blah. If they got a better name or a better way of saying it that doesn't involve me uttering 2 paragraphs to describe it every time, I'm all ears. So for right now, we're going to call it grunge and alternative. We'll throw in alternative as well. All right? So there's always been this narrative that there was this rivalry and animosity between hard rock, heavy metal, and grunge, that these two genres were sort of at each other's throats. Now, in the past few years, bands from that era on both sides of it kind of downplayed the whole narrative and said, you know what, the whole thing was created by a few rock writers to sell magazines. And they were right to a certain extent. And, a lot of the metal guys, to their credit, said, you know what, we had it coming. Music is always moving forward, especially rock music. There's always a progression. So they were next in line. They were next in line to come forward. They were bringing the fresh new music. So, yeah, more power to them. Now, I will say, I do seem to notice that the heavy metal acts, the heavy metal bands that are the most magnanimous in their praise for grunge were usually the ones who managed to make their fortunes before the rug pulled, okay? But, again, you're in an era, you've got young dudes full of testosterone and vinegar, so yeah, there's going to be some dick measuring and some elbows, So now, of course, everybody's a little more chill, they've got a little more perspective, and maybe the whole thing was overblown. But if you lived through that era, there was no denying that grunge came off, in many ways, often came off as a direct sort of repudiation of everything that rock had become. It wasn't that they weren't not interested in being rock stars. They were actually anti-rock star. They rejected the whole notion of it. So why is that? Well, there's a lot of facets to it. It isn't just about certain attitudes. It's even about the music itself. So back in the 60s, the great, that great sort of explosion of rock music that you had, most of the great bands of that era started out playing covers. They were covering Elvis and Bo Diddley and covering blues songs and like that. So again, the Beatles were covering early rockabilly hits. The Rolling Stones started out as an English blues band. Fleetwood Mac started out as an English blues band. Led Zeppelin started out, they saw themselves as an English blues band originally. Black Sabbath started out as an English blues band. So by the early 70s, blues-based rock was pretty dominant, but there were a lot of fans and a lot of, artists who were kind of done with it. They wanted something different. There's a story, I think it was Lou Reed told about when they were starting the Velvet Underground, that anyone in the band who played a blues lick would get fined, which was a joke because nobody had any money anyway. Socially, you had the civil rights movement occurring in the 1950s and the 1960s. You had the overturning of traditional attitudes and opinions towards sex and illicit drug use. And on those two in particular, it was ostensibly to free ourselves from the shackles of old, outdated, puritanical ideas and to usher in some new social order. But by the 1970s, all of the, we're expanding our minds stuff went pretty much straight out the window, and it just devolved into straight ahead hedonism. So all of that sort of naughty behavior, it just became artistic license. It was seen as perks of the profession. Yeah, this is what rock stars did. This is how they behaved. It became the origins of the sort of the rock star mythos. And if you were a rock star, you didn't pay attention. You didn't obey the normal rules. And if you wanted to live in a castle and crash your Rolls Royce into the pool while snorting blow off a hooker's ass, well, then that's what you did, because rock stars don't play by the rules. And above all, there was the money. I mean, money, 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 money everywhere. Money like it was coming out of a fire hose. You see, back in the 50s, back in the early days of rock and roll, most artists, there was no money to be made in it. It was you were a musician. This is what you did. You made some records. You toured, and that was your living. It was very much a working class kind of living, especially if you were playing something as disreputable as rock and roll. Most artists who were playing it partly too because they were sort of social and cultural outcasts themselves. So the music sort of fitted them. Starting in the 60s, though, that began to change. You had this sort of Cambrian explosion of rock music and popular music in general. You had the baby boomer generation coming into their teenage and young adult years and injecting all of this money into this industry because they loved music. And suddenly, being in a rock band could be lucrative. And along with that, you had advancements in recording technology, so now the music sounded better than ever. You had advancements in live sound technology, so now the shows sounded better than ever. And instead of playing in front of a few hundred people, artists could play in front of thousands or sometimes tens of thousands of people. By the early 70s, it had all blossomed into this huge industry and ecosystem. And you started seeing some artists and some fans getting a little ambivalent about all of the money that was being made. And they thought that maybe people were losing sight of the artistry of it all. They didn't think that a creative process should be commodified or should be monetized. So now you have this sort of simmering disaffection with certain fans and certain artists within the music community. They didn't like the way rock and roll sounded anymore. They felt that it had lost its social and political edge and kind of just sort of descended in this lazy pseudo-philosophical hedonism, and they didn't like the way it was being commercialized. So now in the late 70s, enter punk. So the punks sought to re-inject, among other things, wanted to re-inject sort of the social and political edge that rock music they thought had lost. They rejected all the music that was being put out at that time as just being stupid, bloated corporate music. They just rejected it all. They saw that everything around them, all the music that was being made at that point, was just being kind of stupid and lazy, and they held no real hope for the future for themselves. It was kind of intense, man. So they created this form of music that was populist in nature. Anybody can play it. It was simple. It rejected the complexity that had come into rock. They were very political and very socially active. And it was supposed to be a form of music that was just, there was almost no point to it. It was certainly not supposed to be commercialized. It was there to be enjoyed and nothing more. Just returning to music as music should be. Just something that human beings enjoy with one another. That was kind of the idea. Also just being snotty and shitty. Now, punk never really took off in the United States. I mean, there were enclaves of it that held on, but there was never any danger of it sort of overthrowing mainstream rock music in terms of popularity in the United States. But it never completely went away either. There was this sort of simmering underground that remained all throughout the late 70s and into the 80s. And this is where you start seeing a divide occurring. A lot of future grunge musicians and alternative musicians had started out in the 70s listening to heavy music and heavy metal and that sort of thing. But once they discovered punk, they kind of veered off in a different direction. And eventually they would take heavy music and punk and create something new and fresh and vibrant. But just as importantly, they had adopted the attitudes and the philosophy of punk. And that's where the trouble begins. Remember when I said by the end of the 80s, metal was hip, cool, and relevant? Well, it had also begun to get a little stale and complacent as well by that time, and a little bit way too sure of itself. By the end of the 80s, heavy metal in terms of commercial success, was the dominant form of rock music. You had, the old guard, the new wave of British heavy metal over in Britain. You had European metal. You had the Pretty Boys over in LA. You had the Thrash Goons over on the East Coast and in San Francisco. Everybody had their territories. Everybody was getting paid. And then Now, here's the thing: hard rock and heavy metal didn't collapse overnight once grunge came along. It wasn't like Nirvana put out Nevermind, and the next day Motley Crue are out parking cars somewhere. And as a matter of fact, most rock fans listened to both genres with no problem at all. But there were some bands and there were some partisans within the grunge community, within the genre, who had a real problem with heavy metal and everything that it had become. A lot of the grunge acts were very politically and socially active. They were very populist and down to earth, the anti-rock star. And heavy metal was none of that. And this new aesthetic, that sort of populist, down to earth, rejecting all of the glitz and glamour that had just occurred for the past 20 years, that, as much as anything, is what tanked heavy metal. Because here's the thing: heavy metal was no longer considered cool. And in youth culture, cool is everything. And I'll give you just one example here of what I'm talking about in terms of youth culture and how it can just turn on a dime. And it's just a lot of times just based on sentiment. When I graduated high school in 1988, for that entire previous decade, there had been this fascination with just young people with Southern California. It seemed that's like where all the fun was being had, especially once all of those metal bands and hard rock bands came out of Southern California and LA. So as a result, you had Midwestern dorks like me who were talking like Jeff Spicoli out of Fast Times from Ridgemont High. Hey, brah, all I need are some tasty ways and a cool buzz, and I'm good to go. Completely stupid and ridiculous. Fast forward a few years, I noticed young people started taking on, in the Midwest, kind of like a Northwestern / Seattle kind of accent that they heard all of these newer bands, from Seattle speaking with. It kind of sounds suspiciously Canadian. But anyway, another way of looking at it is looking at movies from like the middle of the 20th century. You had this period in movie making where you had old school stage actors who had started out on the stage and they had moved and migrated into movies, versus a newer guard of actors who had come, yes, maybe they had started on stage, but then they were coming specifically to act in movies. And you'll notice a difference in their performance styles. The older actors who started out on stage, compared to a more modern actor or like a method actor, their performances seem like really stiff and overblown and almost kind of ridiculous. And the reason that is because they started out on the stage where they had to exaggerate their movements and speak very loudly so everyone in the cheap seats in the back could hear them. In contrast, you had these newer actors who realized that their audience wasn't an audience in a hall, it was a camera. And so their performances became more nuanced and more human and more natural. Now, grunge was certainly big, heavy music, but they did away with a lot of the bombast and the theatrics that heavy metal had brought along. And a lot of the topics of their songs and their lyrics had a lot more nuance to them. So you have these two genres of music, and comparing the two was kind of like looking, if you watch an older movie where you have a traditional stage actor acting next to a younger, more method actor, and the stage actor comes off as being ridiculous a lot of times. And that's how heavy metal started coming off. It started looking ridiculous. So you have grunge staging a revolution, but like their punk ancestors, they don't care. Like the Joker, they're not trying to take over a system. They seem to be trying to actively collapse it. Some men don't care about things like mechanical royalties or MTV awards. Some men just want to watch the world burn. And there have always been musicians and artists in music who express their doubts or express a sense of imposter syndrome at their success and wondering whether we're really worthy of it. But it seemed like grunge as a whole were really ambivalent about the success that they were having. And there was another contrast between the two styles of music. Now, hard rock and heavy metal had spent decades building up an enormous fan base, and it was very inclusive. Any starry-eyed fan or musician who wanted to get into it, they'd trek out to LA or maybe New York or whatever, and the whole scene, the whole vibe was, hey, welcome to the party. Let's see what you got. Now, grunge and alternative music, by comparison, kind of had a shallow bench because they were more regional forms of music, and so they had a smaller fan base to begin with. And for all of their populist rhetoric, sometimes they could come off as a wee bit hipsterish or elitist, because it got to a point of like any band that came out after the mid-90s were seen as posers or corporate shills. And that's not really a great recipe for the long-term survival of a genre. But they didn't care. Now, the huge irony of this all is that while these two genres of rock were ostensibly slugging it out with one another, rap and hip-hop come along on a drive-by and smoke everybody. So for the past 20 years, rap and hip hop have become the dominant form of music that teenagers listen to piss off their parents. But in the end, yeah, it's just water under the bridge. And although to this day you can go on social media sites and see people who will still carry on this grudge between this feud between these two genres of music, most of us who are fortunate enough to have lived during that era just recognize the fact that it was a great time to be alive and a great time to enjoy a lot of just phenomenal music. And in terms of putting all that silly crap behind us, I don't think you can find two better people to represent that than Axl Rose and Dave Grohl. And for any of you who don't know, back in the early 90s, they were in two bands that were feuding with one another. Now, back in the early 90s, Guns N' Roses was arguably the biggest band on the planet, and you had this young upstart band in the form of Nirvana. Axl Rose really liked Nirvana, recognized that they were a great new band, and recognized what a talent that Kurt Cobain was. And he reached out to Kurt Cobain and Nirvana personally and professionally. There was just one problem. Nirvana and Kurt Cobain didn't want anything to do with Axl or Guns N' Roses. And the reason was partly personal. Apparently, I guess Kurt Cobain, what he saw of Axl Rose in public was a person that he didn't necessarily want to hang out with. And also to Nirvana and to Kurt Cobain, Guns N' Roses sort of represented all of that bloated corporate rock and roll that they didn't want to be associated with. Naturally, Axl got a bit resentful about all this, and it all came to a head. I think it was the 1992 MTV Music Awards, where both bands were backstage, which that was a bad idea to begin with. And it kind of turned into a shouting match between Axl Rose, Kurt Cobain, and his then wife, Courtney Love. At one point, allegedly, as Courtney started mouthing off to Axl may have said words to the effect, looking at Kurt, saying, "You better get your bitch in line," or some words like that. Yow! So things deteriorated even further because then Nirvana went out on stage to perform, and Dave Grohl, then the drummer of Nirvana, started heckling and catcalling Axl from the stage. Fast forward to 2015. Dave Grohl is now the frontman for the Foo Fighters, and on the middle of a tour falls off stage and breaks his leg. So then he's probably seen this thing. He constructed this ridiculously awesome rock throne. It looked like, from like Game of Thrones. It was just this huge throne with guitar necks coming out of it and everything. And it was cool. And he would sit there with his broken leg propped up and perform on stage so they could finish up their tour. Then the very next year, Guns N' Roses gets together on their reunion tour. Early in the tour, Axl Rose breaks his foot. He reaches out to Dave Grohl, says, "Hey man, that throne you had, can I rent it off you?" And Dave Grohl said, "No, you can't rent it. Just use it, man. Compliments, my compliments." And so, yeah, you have these two guys who a couple of decades ago were in these, supposedly warring camps with one another. And yeah, fast forward a few decades now, they're older and they're wiser, and now they realize that they have a shared experience as being two rock veterans, from really, really storied bands and a great time in music history. So yeah, that's going to do it for now. I kind of feel like this is probably going to be a long one, so if you stuck around to the end, I really appreciate it. And yeah, like and subscribe to the channel if you could. And I'll leave a link for our Bandcamp link. If you're into hard rock, check us out, man. Like I said, we're really proud of what we accomplished. So y'all take it easy.